She was fired and humiliated by a millionaire's wife without a chance to explain herself. But what no one imagined was that this man would not accept it in silence. What he discovers later changes everything and exposes a truth that no one expected. If this beautiful story of resilience and love interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Continuing. The clock struck 6:20 in the morning when Edward Sterling opened his eyes. Another day began the same way as all the others in recent months, perhaps years. He got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, but he knew it didn't matter. Eleanor was already awake on the other side of the bed, her back to him, staring fixedly at the wall as if searching for answers on its smooth, white surface. Neither of them said good morning. They hadn't said it for a long time. The house in Chicago's Gold Coast was large, modern, and tastefully decorated by one of the best professionals in the city. Every room had its function, every object its place. Everything was perfectly organized, everything was impeccably clean, but something essential was missing inside. Edward felt it every day as he descended the marble stairs, as he crossed the living room with its Italian designer sofas, as he passed through the integrated kitchen with imported granite countertops. The house was beautiful, but it was also empty of something he couldn't name. While having coffee alone on the veranda, watching the pool that was rarely used, Edward thought of his son. Oliver was 6 years old and was a child far too quiet for his age. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for attention. He simply existed in an almost invisible way, like a small ghost floating through the hallways without making a sound. The teachers at school had mentioned to Eleanor that the boy interacted little with his peers, preferred to be alone during recess, and always drew with dark colors. Eleanor had replied that it was just a phase, that it would soon pass. But Edward knew it wasn't just a phase. Oliver was reflecting what he saw at home. Children are sponges. They absorb everything around them, capturing what adults try to hide. And what there was to capture in that house was silence, distance, and two people who shared the same space but lived in separate worlds. Edward remembered when everything was different. He remembered Eleanor smiling, conversations that lasted for hours, shared plans for the future. He remembered when Oliver was born and they stayed awake all night just watching the baby sleep, marveling at that tiny, perfect being. But that seemed to have happened in another life with other people who no longer existed. Work consumed Edward. His import-export company grew every quarter. The numbers were always positive and investors were satisfied. He left home at 7 in the morning and returned after 9 at night. Weekends were also dedicated to meetings, business trips, and reports that needed to be reviewed. Eleanor, for her part, had built her own routine. Gym in the morning, lunches with friends, culinary courses, social events. They hardly saw each other, and when they were together, they talked only about practical matters. Bills to pay, Oliver's school commitments, decisions about house renovations. It was in one of these quick conversations between a bite of toast and a sip of coffee that Eleanor mentioned the need to hire someone to look after Oliver in the afternoons. The previous nanny had resigned to care for her mother, who was having health problems, and since then Oliver had been staying with the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who did the best she could but had other responsibilities. Edward agreed without much thought. One more practical decision, one more problem solved. Eleanor said she had already spoken with a few candidates and would choose someone by the end of the week. 3 days later, on a rainy Thursday, Edward arrived home earlier than usual. A meeting had been cancelled and he decided to take the opportunity to pick up some documents he needed. Upon entering the front door, he heard voices in the living room. One was Eleanor's, formal and direct as always. The other was different, soft, calm, with a cadence that seemed to soothe even the sound of the rain outside. He approached and saw Eleanor sitting in one of the armchairs with a folder of documents on her lap, and in front of her, a young woman of simple but careful appearance. She wore a white blouse and dark jeans, her brown hair tied in a ponytail. When Edward entered, she stood up immediately, extending her hand with a discreet but genuine smile. Eleanor made the introductions without much enthusiasm. Grace Miller, 26 years old, a degree in early childhood education, experience with children of different ages, impeccable references. She would start the following day. Edward shook her hand and noticed it was firm without being aggressive. Grace's eyes were dark and conveyed something he hadn't seen in a long time. Serenity, perhaps, or a natural kindness that didn't need to be forced. He caught himself staring for a second too long and quickly looked away, feeling strange. Grace smiled at him again and said she was very happy with the opportunity and would do her best to take care of Oliver. Her voice had a sincerity that seemed impossible to fake. Edward just nodded and retired to the office, leaving Eleanor to finish the final arrangements. The next morning, when Edward went down for breakfast, Grace was already there. She was talking to Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, laughing softly at some story the housekeeper was telling. Upon seeing Edward, she greeted him politely and said she was waiting for Oliver to wake up to get to know him better. Oliver came down a few minutes later, still in his pajamas, his eyes puffy from sleep. When he saw Grace, he stopped in the middle of the stairs, observing her with that natural distrust children have toward strangers. Grace didn't approach him. She simply smiled and said good morning from a distance without invading the boy's space. Then she continued talking to Mrs. Gable as if nothing had happened. Edward observed the scene while pretending to read the news on his phone. That was smart, not forcing it, not pressuring him, letting the child approach in his own time. Oliver had breakfast in silence, eating his toast with jam without looking at anyone. But every now and then he cast quick glances in Grace's direction, as if he were studying this new presence in his routine. In the following days, Edward began to observe more. Not intentionally at first, just coincidences of timing that caused him to be home when Grace was with Oliver. He noticed that she never forced conversation, never demanded attention. She was simply present. Sometimes she sat on the living room floor with a storybook and began to read aloud without waiting for Oliver to approach. Other times, she assembled a puzzle alone on the veranda table. And always, Oliver ended up approaching. Slowly, cautiously, but curious. It was in the second week that Edward saw his son smile for the first time in months. Grace had brought a box of modeling clay and was making clumsy animals that looked more like monsters than anything else. She laughed at her own lack of skill, and Oliver, sitting beside her, began to help, showing her how to make the elephant's legs firmer. And then he laughed. A small sound, almost shy but genuine. Edward felt a tightening in his chest. That was his son, that cheerful, curious, lively boy. He had been there all along, just hidden under layers of silence that the house had built around him. Eleanor also noticed the change, but her reaction was different. She watched Grace with critical eyes, looking for flaws, waiting for mistakes. She demanded detailed reports on every activity, questioned choices, and changed decisions. Grace received it all with patience, never talking back, simply adjusting what was requested and continuing her work. Edward noticed the tension but didn't know how to intervene. It was Eleanor's territory, after all. She had hired Grace. She was the one managing the household routine. But it bothered him to see that young woman treated with such coldness when all she did was care for Oliver with true dedication. One afternoon, returning from a meeting, Edward found Oliver and Grace in the garden. The boy was covered in dirt, his knees stained with grass, laughing as he helped Grace plant flower seedlings in a flower bed that had been abandoned for months. The two were talking about colors, about how plants need sun and water to grow, and about patience. Eleanor watched from the living room window with her arms crossed, her face set. When she realized Edward was beside her, she commented in a dry tone that Grace was letting the boy get too dirty, that it wasn't appropriate. Edward didn't respond. He just kept looking at the garden, at the son who finally looked like a real child, and at that young woman who in a few weeks had achieved something neither he nor Eleanor had managed in months, bringing Oliver back to life. That night, as he lay down to sleep, Edward thought about Grace, not in an inappropriate way, but with genuine curiosity. Who was this young woman? Where did she come from? What made her have so much patience, so much light inside her? She always arrived punctually at 2 in the afternoon and left at 8 in the evening, 6 hours that completely transformed the energy of the house. And then, when she left, everything returned to the previous silence. Edward began to notice something strange. During the day, Grace was all lightness and dedication, but when late afternoon arrived, as the clock approached 8, something changed in her face. The smile was still there, but her eyes looked tired. She checked the clock frequently as if she were worried about something, and when she finally said goodbye, took her simple bag and walked out the door, Edward saw her countenance change completely. Her shoulders slumped, her face lost its serene expression, and she walked toward the gate with a haste that seemed urgent. He watched this happen for several days in a row, and each time the restlessness inside him grew a little more. What was waiting for Grace out there? Where was she going in such a hurry? And why, despite all the joy she brought into that house, did she seem to carry an invisible weight with her every night? Edward didn't know it yet, but that innocent curiosity was about to turn into something much bigger, something that would change not only Grace's life, but his own and everyone's inside that house in the Gold Coast. The following weeks brought such a significant change in Oliver that even Eleanor, with all her resistance to admitting anything positive about Grace, could not ignore it. The boy woke up earlier now, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. He ran down the stairs, still in his pajamas, asking if Grace had arrived yet. When Mrs. Gable replied that there were still a few hours to go, he sighed with disappointment, but soon cheered up, starting to plan what they would do together that afternoon. Edward observed all this from the other side of the breakfast table, pretending to be concentrated on his emails, but actually paying attention to every word from his son. Oliver talked now. He didn't just answer questions with monosyllables. He initiated conversations, told stories, and described in detail the things he had done with Grace the day before. Yesterday they had built a fort with sheets in the living room. The day before that, they had done experiments with water and food coloring in the kitchen under Mrs. Gable's amused supervision. The day before that, they had read 3 chapters of a book about a boy traveling across the United States, learning about different cultures. Eleanor listened to all this in silence, with an expression Edward couldn't completely decipher. There was relief there, yes. Relief at seeing her son finally acting like a normal child. But there was also something darker, something that seemed to bother her deeply. Jealousy, perhaps, or fear. Fear that someone else was managing to reach Oliver in a way she herself no longer could. Edward tried to talk to his wife about it one night after Oliver was already asleep. He mentioned how good it was to see the boy happy again, how Grace was doing an exceptional job. Eleanor nodded, but her eyes said something else. She muttered something about not thinking it was healthy for a child to get so attached to an employee, that it was important to maintain boundaries, that professionalism was essential. Edward didn't push it. Lately, any attempt at deep conversation with Eleanor ended in a wall of short answers and evasive looks. It was easier to let things be, to maintain the superficial peace that governed that house. But with Grace, strangely, Edward found himself wanting to talk more. Not about anything specific, just talk. He began to arrive home a little earlier some afternoons, justifying to himself that he needed to check some documents in the office, review some contracts, or make some calls that required silence. But the truth was that he liked seeing Oliver interacting with Grace. He liked observing the dynamic between the two. And yes, he liked exchanging a few words with that young woman who seemed to have wisdom far beyond her 26 years. Grace was different from all the people who frequented Edward's life. She didn't talk about clothing brands, imported cars, trips to Aspen, or real estate investments. She talked about books she had read, music she liked, or an interesting documentary she had watched. She talked about the importance of truly listening to children, not just waiting for them to stop talking. She talked about how every child had their own time, and that respecting that time was a form of love. Edward found himself thinking about these conversations later, when he was alone in the car returning from a meeting, or when he worked late in the office. Grace's words echoed in his mind, simple but profound, challenging many of the certainties he had about education, about family, and about what really mattered in life. It was on a Tuesday, nearly a month and a half after Grace had started working, that Edward decided to observe her behavior more closely at the end of her shift. He was in the office reviewing some reports when he heard her voice saying goodbye to Oliver downstairs. It was almost 8 o'clock. He stood up silently and went to the window that overlooked the street. From there he could see Grace cross the gate and walk down the sidewalk toward the bus stop. She walked fast, almost running, looking at the watch on her wrist every few steps. When she reached the stop, she stood there, restless, shifting from one foot to the other. The bus took almost 15 minutes to arrive, and in that time, Edward saw the anxiety grow on her face, even from a distance. When the bus finally stopped and she got on, Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't immediately identify. Worry, perhaps, or guilt. Guilt for never having asked if she needed a ride, if the hours were comfortable for her, or if she had any difficulty with transportation. In the following days, he watched the same scene repeat itself. Grace always leaving at 8 sharp, always in a hurry, always with that expression that mixed exhaustion and worry. And he also began to notice that she arrived at 2 in the afternoon without failing a single day. But sometimes she looked exhausted, as if she had already lived an entire day before arriving there. Edward's curiosity turned into genuine concern. He began to pay attention to small details. Grace always brought her own food from home, never accepting when Mrs. Gable offered something from the kitchen. She wore the same clothes in rotation, always clean and well-kept, but visibly old. Her phone was a basic model with a cracked screen on one corner, and she never, ever mentioned plans for the weekend, trips, outings, nothing that indicated a life outside of that job. One afternoon, while Oliver was in his room getting some books, Edward found himself alone with Grace in the living room. She was organizing the toys they had used during the afternoon, placing everything in its place with care. He asked, trying to sound casual, if she lived far away. Grace stopped what she was doing for a second, seemed to hesitate, then smiled and replied that she lived in the far suburbs, in a working-class neighborhood near the city limits. It was a bit far, yes, but she didn't mind. The commute gave her time to read, to think, and to rest a little. Edward did a quick mental calculation. That neighborhood was nearly a 2-hour bus and train ride from the Gold Coast, depending on traffic. That meant Grace probably left home at noon to arrive at 2 and got home nearly at 10 at night. 4 hours of public transportation every day to work 6 hours. He wanted to ask more, wanted to understand better, but Oliver came running back with the books and the moment passed. But the information stayed with Edward, bothering him in a way he didn't expect. That night, instead of working late as he usually did, Edward found himself researching that area of the city. He read about the region, the transportation difficulties, the cost of living, and the stories of the people who lived there. Many were stories of struggle, of hard work, of families that got by with very little but maintained dignity and hope. He thought of Grace making that long commute every day, returning home late at night, probably tired but still arriving at his house the next day with a genuine smile and energy to take care of Oliver. That said a lot about her character, about her determination and strength. Edward began to observe Grace with different eyes, no longer just as his son's caregiver, but as a complete person with her own life, her own challenges, and her own silent battles. And the more he observed, the more admiration he felt. One day, Oliver mentioned during dinner that Grace had told a story about when she was a child and played with her cousins in a small neighborhood park near her house. Eleanor furrowed her brow and commented that it was important for Grace to focus on educational activities and not spend time telling Oliver personal stories. Edward felt a sudden surge of anger, something rare for him. He replied more sharply than he intended that personal stories were exactly what created true connection between people, and that perhaps they should all do more of that. Eleanor looked at him in surprise, then looked away and changed the subject. After that dinner, Edward couldn't stop thinking. What was happening to him? Why was he defending Grace so vehemently? Why did he care so much about what she faced outside that house? The answer came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Oliver had a slight fever, and Grace stayed with him in his room, reading stories in a low voice while the boy rested. Edward needed a document that was in one of the cabinets in the room and went up silently so as not to interrupt. As he approached the half-open door, he heard Grace's voice. She was no longer reading a book. She was telling a story of her own, about a girl who lived far away, but who every day made a long journey to take care of a special boy. The girl got tired sometimes, Grace said, but she never gave up, because every smile from the boy was worth the whole journey. Edward heard Oliver ask, in that sleepy voice of someone nearly asleep, if the girl in the story was her. Grace laughed softly and replied that maybe she was, that each of us was a character in our own story and the author of our own destiny. Something inside Edward broke at that moment. a clear and painful realization that this young woman was giving his son something he himself had failed to give: presence, attention, genuine and selfless love. And she did this while carrying her own burdens, while facing her own difficulties, without ever using them as an excuse to do less. He went down the stairs without taking the document, went straight to the office and closed the door. He sat in the chair and just stayed there, thinking about how he had built a life of external success, but internal emptiness. Thinking about how he had a huge house but no home. Thinking about how he had a wife but no companion. Thinking about how he had a son but almost no real connection with him. And thinking about Grace, about how she, with so little, had so much to offer, how her difficult life had not hardened her heart, but apparently made it more compassionate, more capable of seeing and meeting the needs of others. Edward knew he was in dangerous territory. He knew that these thoughts, these observations, this growing admiration could easily turn into something more. But he tried to convince himself that it was just gratitude, just recognition for a job well done, just appreciation for someone who was helping his son. But deep down, in a place he wasn't yet ready to admit, he knew it was more than that, much more. And that realization, while it frightened him, also made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. He felt alive again, with doubts, with restlessness, with questions, but definitely alive. As the rain beat against the office window, Edward made a decision. He needed to better understand Grace's situation. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because he felt there was something he could do, some way to help, to give back a little of everything she was doing for Oliver, for that house, and yes, for himself, even if she didn't know it. What he didn't imagine was how much that decision would change absolutely everything. The discovery happened by chance, or perhaps by a combination of chance and the growing attention Edward dedicated to everything involving Grace. It was a Friday, and he had left the office early to pick up some documents a client needed to sign before the weekend. Traffic was particularly chaotic. A protest on Michigan Avenue had diverted the flow of cars to alternative routes, and Edward decided to follow a different path than usual. That was how he found himself crossing neighborhoods he didn't normally frequent, passing through narrow streets and simple buildings, so different from the world of glass and polished concrete in the Gold Coast. He was stopped at a traffic light when he saw something that made him brake even after the light turned green. On the other side of the street, coming out of a discount pharmacy, was Grace. But it wasn't the Grace he knew from work. This Grace was hunched under the weight of several plastic bags, her face marked by an expression of deep exhaustion. She stopped on the sidewalk, rested the bags on the ground for a moment, wiped her hand across her face as if trying to gather strength, and then picked everything up again and moved forward, entering a side alley. Edward parked quickly, without thinking much about what he was doing. He got out of the car and followed the direction Grace had taken, keeping enough distance not to be seen. The alley led to a set of small row houses, old buildings that seemed to resist time more out of stubbornness than proper maintenance. Grace entered one of the houses in the middle, one with peeling paint and bars on the windows. Edward stood on the corner, trying to decide what to do. Go back to the car and forget he had seen that, or ring the doorbell and risk appearing invasive, completely crossing the boundaries between employer and employee. Before he could decide, the door of the house opened again and an older woman appeared. She leaned on a cane and talked to Grace, who was standing on the threshold. Even from a distance, Edward could see the concern on both their faces. The conversation lasted a few minutes. Then Grace went inside and closed the door. Edward returned to the car with more questions than answers. Who was that woman? Grace's mother? And why did she look so fragile? The pharmacy bags, the exhaustion on Grace's face, the modest house, everything began to form a picture that Edward hardly dared to complete. He couldn't concentrate on work for the rest of the day. His mind constantly returned to that scene, to those bags of medicine, to that small house that probably harbored more problems than he could imagine. Over the weekend, Edward did something he had never done before. He searched for Grace's full name in the company systems, found the address registered on her employment records, and confirmed it was the same place he had seen on Friday. Then, feeling half detective and half intruder, he researched the area. It was a neighborhood on the far south side, with high unemployment rates, poor public transportation, and a lack of basic infrastructure. He looked at his own house while doing this research: the impeccably manicured garden, the pool that cost a fortune to maintain, the 3 cars in the garage, the office with imported furniture. And he thought of Grace, taking a 2-hour bus ride to come work in a place so different from her reality, taking care of the son of a rich man, while her own family probably needed care she could barely provide. On Monday, Edward arrived home earlier than usual. He found Grace and Oliver in the garden, planting sunflower seeds in small pots. The boy was excited, talking about how he was going to water the plants every day and wait for them to grow. Grace listened attentively, asking questions, encouraging his excitement. Edward waited until Oliver went inside to get some water. Then he approached Grace, who was still kneeling by the pots, wiping dirt from her hands. He began awkwardly, asking if everything was okay, if she needed anything. Grace smiled and said everything was great, that working with Oliver was wonderful, and she was very grateful for the opportunity. Edward hesitated, then decided to be direct. He told her he had passed through her neighborhood on Friday and had seen her leaving the pharmacy. He didn't mention he had followed her to the house, but he made it clear he was worried. Grace's expression changed completely. The smile disappeared, replaced by a mixture of surprise and something close to fear. She stood up quickly, nervously wiping her hands on her pants. Edward realized he had invaded a space that was too private and tried to back off. He said he didn't want to be meddling, that he was just concerned because she seemed so burdened. Grace took a deep breath, seemed to consider her options, and then, perhaps because she no longer had the strength to carry it all alone, she began to speak. She told him about her mother, Martha, who had suffered serious health complications after a failed surgery a few years ago. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it required constant care, physical therapy, expensive medications, and frequent medical follow-ups. Her father had left when Grace was a teenager and was never heard from again. She had a younger sister, Lily, who was 18 and trying to finish high school while working part-time in a shop. Grace was the one supporting the household. With her salary as a caregiver, she paid the rent, bought her mother's medicines, and helped with basic expenses. But even working as much as she could, the money was never enough. She had accumulated debts at the pharmacy, fallen behind on electricity and water bills, and sacrificed meals to ensure her mother didn't go without the necessary medications. She told all this simply, without drama, almost as if she were describing the weather. But Edward saw the pain behind the words, saw the weight this 26-year-old woman carried on her shoulders, a weight that would be heavy for someone twice her age and with far more resources. When Grace finished speaking, there were tears in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly and said she didn't want this to affect her work, that she would continue giving her best for Oliver, and that he didn't need to worry. Edward felt something tear inside his chest. This extraordinary woman was apologizing, worried about keeping him at ease, when she was the one who needed support, help, and someone to care. He didn't think much before speaking. He said he wanted to help, that he was in a position to do so, and that it would be a pleasure. Grace immediately refused, saying she couldn't accept charity, that it wasn't right, that she was already too grateful for the job. But Edward insisted. He explained it wasn't charity, it was recognition. Recognition for everything she was doing for Oliver, for the transformation she had brought to that house, for the dedication she showed every day despite her own difficulties. He said he had the means to help, and that it would be a waste not to do so when it could make a real difference in her life and her family's. The conversation lasted for more than an hour. Edward proposed paying all of Grace's accumulated debts at the pharmacy, covering her mother's medical costs that weren't covered by insurance, and significantly increasing her salary. Grace resisted, argued, and cried again, but Edward was firm. He wanted to do this. He needed to do this. Finally, Grace accepted, but with one condition. She didn't want Eleanor to know. Not because there was anything wrong, but because she knew Edward's wife already viewed her with suspicion, and any additional favor would only make things worse. Edward agreed, although he knew that keeping secrets from Eleanor would create another layer of complication in his already fragile marriage. In the following days, Edward acted quickly. He went personally to the pharmacy where Grace had debts and paid everything off. He arranged for her mother's medications to be delivered monthly, already paid for. He transferred a significant amount to Grace's account, enough to cover 3 months' rent and other basic expenses, and he adjusted her salary to an amount that would allow her to live with dignity, not just survive. When Grace received confirmation of all this, she showed up at the house crying. But these were different tears now. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. She thanked him repeatedly, said she didn't know how she could ever repay him, that she would do anything. Edward just smiled and said she was already repaying him every day, just by being who she was. From that moment on, something changed between them. It was no longer just a professional relationship. There was a deeper connection, based on mutual trust, shared vulnerability, and a silent understanding that they both genuinely cared for each other. Edward began to arrive home early frequently, no longer using work excuses but simply wanting to be there. He talked to Grace about various subjects, discovering that she had a fascinating worldview forged by experiences so different from his own. She read a lot, despite barely having the time or money to buy books. She visited the local library whenever she could and devoured everything from classic American literature to philosophy and psychology. Edward found himself bringing books for her, things he had at home and had never read, or that he bought specifically because he knew she would like them. Grace accepted with gratitude, but always with care, always making it clear that she expected nothing beyond what she had already received. Oliver noticed the growing closeness between his father and Grace and seemed to flourish even more because of it. Now he had 2 adults truly present in his life, 2 adults who cared not only about his basic needs, but about his thoughts, his feelings, and his dreams. The house began to transform in subtle but significant ways. There was more laughter, more conversation, more life. Edward caught himself smiling for no specific reason, just for the simple pleasure of being home, of being near his son, and of being near Grace. But while this new dynamic brought joy to some corners of the house, it also created shadows in others. Eleanor observed everything with increasingly suspicious eyes. She noticed Edward arriving earlier, noticed the conversations between him and Grace, noticed how Oliver spoke of the 2 of them, almost as if they were a team. One night, after Grace had already left, Eleanor confronted Edward. She asked directly what was going on, why he was so interested in the caregiver, if there was something she should know. Edward answered with the truth, or at least part of it. He said he admired Grace's work, that he was grateful for the transformation in Oliver, and that he was simply being kind to someone who deserved it. But he knew, even as he spoke, that his words sounded weak, insufficient to explain the intensity of what he really felt. Eleanor didn't seem convinced. She said she was watching, that she wasn't a fool, that she knew when something wasn't right. Then she turned and went to the bedroom, leaving Edward alone in the living room with his own doubts and a growing sense that he was walking towards something inevitable, something that would change everything. And perhaps Edward thought as he looked out the window at the Chicago night, perhaps it was already too late to turn back. Perhaps some changes, once started, had to follow their natural course, regardless of the consequences. What he didn't know yet was how right those intuitions were and how difficult the path ahead would prove to be. The inevitable arrived on a Tuesday afternoon under a heavy sky that threatened a storm. Edward was in a meeting out of town and wouldn't be back until late at night. Oliver had gone to a classmate's birthday party, and Mrs. Gable had gone out to do some grocery shopping. Grace was alone in the house, taking the time to organize Oliver's educational materials when she heard the front door open. Eleanor walked in with firm steps, her face set in an expression Grace had never seen before. She didn't say hello, didn't ask about Oliver. She just walked to where Grace was and stood there, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on her with a disturbing intensity. Grace felt her stomach tighten. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who had made a decision and wouldn't turn back. It was the look of someone about to attack. Eleanor began to speak in a controlled tone, but there was venom under every word. She said she wasn't a fool, that she knew exactly what was happening, that she had noticed the way Grace looked at Edward, the way she found excuses to talk to him, the way she played the victim to gain his attention. Grace tried to interrupt, tried to explain that there was nothing of the sort, that her relationship with Edward was only one of respect and gratitude. But Eleanor didn't want to hear it. She raised her hand, telling Grace to be quiet. and continued. She accused Grace of being calculating, of having come to that house with ulterior motives from the start. She said she knew her type, young, pretty women who took advantage of successful men, who faked humility and kindness but were only after money and status. She said she had investigated, that she knew Edward was paying her debts, that he had increased her salary beyond reason, that he was giving her gifts. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. She tried again to explain, saying that Edward had offered help because he saw she was going through difficulties, that she hadn't asked for anything, that it all happened because he was a generous person and she truly needed support. But Eleanor laughed, a bitter, joyless laugh. She said Grace must think everyone was an idiot, that she could fool everyone with that saintly facade. She said she knew women like her studied psychology exactly for that, to manipulate, to get into people's heads, to make them feel special. The words were like stabs, each more painful than the last. Grace felt her heart racing, her hands trembling. She had faced many difficult things in life, had gone through trials that would test anyone's strength, but she had never been humiliated like this, never had her dignity and character attacked with such cruelty. Eleanor continued. She said Grace was destroying her marriage, that she was using Oliver to get close to Edward, that she was intentionally creating an emotional dependency in the boy to make herself indispensable. She said she had seen cases like this before, women who infiltrated families and destroyed everything from the inside out. Grace finally lost her calm. With a trembling but firm voice, she said Eleanor was completely wrong, that she had never had any intention other than taking good care of Oliver, that the affection she felt for the boy was genuine, and that she would never use a child for any kind of manipulation. She said if Eleanor's marriage was having problems, that had nothing to do with her. Those problems existed long before she arrived. It was the mistake Eleanor was waiting for. She stepped forward, her face red with anger, and said Grace had just proven exactly what she suspected. That Grace thought she knew this family better than the wife herself, that she had opinions about their marriage, that she felt entitled to judge. She grabbed Grace's bag, which was on the table, and threw it toward her. She said she didn't want Grace inside the house for another minute, that she was dismissed immediately, and she didn't need notice or anything. She wanted her to take her things and leave, now. Grace stood there in shock. She thought of Oliver, how she would explain it to him. She thought of Edward, how he would react when he found out. She thought of her mother, the bills that would pile up again, the medicines she might not be able to buy anymore. She thought of everything she had built there over the last few months, the true bond she had created with that special boy, the hope that had arisen in her life. She tried one last time. With a broken voice, she asked Eleanor to at least wait for Edward to return, so the three of them could talk and clear everything up. But Eleanor was inflexible. She said there was nothing to clear up, her decision was made, and Grace had exactly 5 minutes to leave or she would call security. Grace looked around the room. She saw the books they had read together scattered on the table. She saw Oliver's drawings hanging on the wall, some of them made specifically for her. She saw the little pots with the sunflower seeds they had planted together starting to sprout. And she felt she was being ripped away from something that had become essential to her. But there was no choice. She took her bag, her few personal things, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned to Eleanor and said, with a dignity that came from somewhere deep inside her, that she was sorry things had ended this way, that she had only tried to do her job the best way possible, that she truly loved Oliver and hoped he would be okay, and that she wished Eleanor would find peace, because it was clear she was suffering too. Eleanor didn't answer. She just stood there, arms still crossed, until Grace crossed the threshold and disappeared. When the door closed, Eleanor felt her legs weaken. She sat on the sofa, her hands trembling. She had done what she needed to do. She had protected her marriage. She had eliminated the threat. But why, then, did she feel so empty? Why did she have the feeling that she had destroyed something she didn't completely understand? She looked around the room, so organized, so beautiful, so perfect, and so absolutely lifeless, without Oliver's laughter, without Grace's stories, without Edward's presence, which lately had returned to light up that space. Suddenly, the house looked exactly like what it was, an expensive, well-decorated structure, but empty of everything that really mattered. Eleanor got up and went to the bedroom. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to convince herself she had done the right thing. But the tears streaming down her face betrayed her own doubts. Meanwhile, Grace walked through the streets of the Gold Coast, almost in a trance. She didn't remember getting to the bus stop, didn't remember boarding the bus. She only regained awareness of where she was when she was already halfway home, staring out the window without seeing anything, feeling an immense void taking over her chest. She thought about calling Edward, telling him what had happened. But what would she say, that his wife had dismissed her because she accused her of trying to destroy their marriage? And did the accusation have any basis? Grace forced herself to be honest with herself. No, she had never had inappropriate intentions. But had she developed feelings for Edward? Had she begun to see him as more than just an employer? The truth was complicated. She admired Edward, yes. She admired his generosity, his silent kindness, the way he was trying to reconnect with his son. And yes, she felt attracted to him, not just physically, but for who he was as a person. But she had never, ever acted on those feelings. She had never crossed any line, never done or said anything inappropriate. But perhaps Eleanor had seen something she herself didn't want to admit. Perhaps her feelings were more obvious than she thought. Perhaps she had been naive to believe she could work in that house, develop such a strong bond with Oliver and Edward, without it creating problems. When she got home, her mother immediately realized something was wrong. Martha, despite all her physical limitations, still had a mother's eyes. She held Grace's hands and asked what had happened. Grace told her everything. Every word of Eleanor's, every accusation, every moment of that humiliation. And as she told it, she finally let the tears fall freely. She cried for having lost the job she loved, for having lost her time with Oliver, for having lost something that had become so important to her that she could barely breathe without it. Martha hugged her daughter and let her cry. When the tears finally subsided, she said something Grace would never forget. She said that sometimes the most hurt people are the ones who hurt others the most, that Eleanor was probably acting out of fear, insecurity and pain that had nothing to do with Grace. She said it wasn't Grace's fault for having a good heart, for doing her job too well, for truly caring. But she also said Grace needed to let go, that she couldn't stay attached to something that didn't belong to her, to a family that wasn't hers, to a situation that would only bring more pain. She said Grace was young, talented, and had a whole life ahead of her, that she would find another job, other children to care for, other opportunities. Grace wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe she could move on, forget, and rebuild. But a part of her knew it wouldn't be that simple, because Oliver wasn't just another child, Edward wasn't just another employer, and that house, however problematic it was, had become a place where she felt important, necessary, and valued. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, imagining what Oliver would think when he woke up the next day and discovered she wasn't there anymore, imagining how Edward would react when he found out what had happened, imagining if she would ever find anything like what she had lost again. And while the city pulsed outside, indifferent to the individual pains of its millions of inhabitants, Grace made a silent decision. She wouldn't go after Edward, wouldn't try to reverse the situation, wouldn't fight for something that clearly didn't belong to her. She would accept what had happened, however unfair it was, and try to move on. What she didn't know was that some stories have a will of their own, and that sometimes, no matter how hard we try to close a door, life finds a way to open it again. Edward arrived home almost at midnight. The meeting in Milwaukee had lasted much longer than expected, and he was tired, wanting only to shower and sleep. But when he walked through the front door, he felt something was different. The house was too silent. It had a quality of emptiness that went beyond the normal. He went upstairs and straight to Oliver's room. The boy was fast asleep, hugging the teddy bear Grace had given him a few weeks ago. Edward stood there for a few minutes, just watching his son sleep, feeling a tenderness that still surprised him sometimes. When he went down to the kitchen to get water, he found Eleanor sitting at the table, still awake despite the hour. She had a half-finished glass of wine in front of her and was looking at her phone without really seeing anything. Edward greeted her and asked if everything was okay. Eleanor took a while to answer, as if she were considering her words carefully. Then she said, in an oddly emotionless voice, that she had let Grace go. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He asked her to repeat it, thinking he had misunderstood. Eleanor repeated it, this time looking directly at him, and added that she had done it because she no longer trusted the girl, that she thought she was overstepping boundaries, and that it was better for everyone that she no longer worked there. Edward had to sit down. He asked when this had happened, why she hadn't waited to talk about it together, why she had made such an important decision alone. Eleanor replied that it had happened that afternoon, that she saw no need to wait, and that it was her decision as the one responsible for the household. The anger Edward felt was so intense it frightened him. He had never felt like shouting at Eleanor, but at that moment he had to make a conscious effort to keep his voice controlled. He said she had no right to do that Grace was essential for Oliver, that she had completely transformed the boy's life. Eleanor laughed, the same bitter laugh as before. She said that was exactly the problem, that Grace was becoming too essential, that she was creating an unhealthy dependency. And then, with eyes shining with something that seemed to be a mixture of hurt and defiance, she asked if it was only for Oliver that Edward was so concerned. Edward was silent. He knew that if he answered at that moment, with that anger boiling inside him, he would say things he couldn't take back. So he just stood up, said they would talk in the morning when they were calmer, and went to the office. But he couldn't work, couldn't concentrate on anything. He sat there staring at the computer screen without seeing it, thinking about Grace receiving that news, being dismissed abruptly after everything she had done, after all her dedication. He thought about how she must have felt humiliated, betrayed, lost. He picked up his phone and thought about calling her, but what would he say? Apologies for his wife? Promises that he would fix everything? How could he fix something like this without finally destroying his marriage, without exposing everything that was happening inside him? The truth that Edward finally admitted to himself, there alone in the office at 2 in the morning, was that he had developed feelings for Grace. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude. It was something deeper, more complex. He cared for her in a way that went far beyond what was appropriate between employer and employee. And perhaps Eleanor had seen that even before he was ready to admit it. But even recognizing his feelings, Edward knew he hadn't acted on them. He had never said anything inappropriate to Grace, never made any move that could be interpreted as romantic interest. He had helped because she needed it and because he could. He had spent more time at home because he wanted to be near his son, or at least that was what he had told himself. The next morning, Oliver woke up asking for Grace. When Eleanor said she wouldn't be coming anymore, that they had hired someone else who would start the following week, the boy fell silent. He didn't cry, didn't make a scene. He just became quiet, with that empty expression Edward knew so well, the same one from before Grace arrived. Seeing his son regressing in a matter of hours was the last straw. Edward waited for Eleanor to leave for the hair salon, and then knelt down to Oliver's level. He asked if he would like Daddy to try to bring Grace back. The boy's eyes lit up for the first time that morning, and he nodded vigorously. Edward knew this meant facing not only Eleanor, but his own contradictions and fears. But he didn't care anymore. He had to try. He went to the office and took Grace's registration file, where her address and phone number were. He tried calling first, but her phone was off or out of range. So he made an impulsive decision. He took the car keys and drove to her neighborhood on the south side. The trip on Wednesday morning was long and full of traffic. Edward had too much time to think, to doubt, to question what he was doing. But he kept driving, moved by a determination he didn't know existed inside him. When he finally reached the street where Grace lived, Edward felt completely out of place. His luxury car drew attention in that simple neighborhood, and he noticed curious looks from people passing by. But he didn't care. He parked in front of the house he had seen weeks ago and got out. Before he could knock, the door opened. Grace was there wearing simple home clothes, her eyes swollen as if she had cried a lot. When she saw Edward, she stood still, clearly surprised and not knowing how to react. Edward spoke first. He apologized for showing up unannounced but said he needed to talk to her. Grace hesitated, then opened the door and invited him in. The house was small and modest, but clean and organized. Martha was sitting in the living room and Grace quickly introduced her. Grace's mother looked at Edward with an expression that mixed curiosity and protection, but she was polite, offering coffee, which he gently refused. Grace took Edward to the small backyard, where they could talk with more privacy. They stood there for a moment, not knowing where to start, the silence heavy between them. Edward finally spoke. He said he had just found out what had happened the day before, that he didn't agree with Eleanor's decision, and that he wanted Grace to come back. Grace shook her head before he even finished. She said she couldn't go back, that it would be impossible to work in that house knowing she wasn't welcome by his wife, that she didn't want to be the cause of more problems. Edward insisted. He said he would talk to Eleanor, that he would make it clear that the decision to keep Grace was his too, that they would find a way to make it work. But Grace remained firm. She said it wasn't just about the job. She had been humiliated, accused of terrible things, and her dignity was worth more than any employment. It was then that Edward asked exactly what Eleanor had said. Grace hesitated, clearly not wanting to repeat the accusations. But Edward insisted, and she finally told him. Every word, every insinuation, every attack on her character. Edward felt the anger return, but this time mixed with shame. Shame that his wife had treated Grace that way, shame for not having been there to protect her, shame for having allowed the situation to reach that point. He approached Grace and said with a sincerity that came from the bottom of his heart that he was deeply sorry, that Eleanor was wrong, that Grace had never done anything inappropriate, that she was one of the most principled people he knew. He said he understood if she didn't want to return, but she at least needed to know that nothing Eleanor had said was true. Grace felt the tears return. She had held so much in over the last few days, had tried to be strong, but hearing those words from Edward broke her defenses. She said she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but Eleanor's words still hurt, still made her question her own feelings and motivations. Edward asked what she meant by that. Grace took a deep breath and decided to be honest. She said she had indeed developed an admiration for him, that she saw him as a good person trying to reconnect with his son, and that perhaps that admiration had been more obvious than she thought. But that she had never ever had inappropriate intentions or acted on those feelings. Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he said he also had developed feelings that went beyond the professional, that he admired Grace not just for her work with Oliver, but for who she was as a person, that he thought about her more than he should, that he found himself looking for excuses to be home when she was there, that he missed her when she left. But he also said he had never acted on those feelings because they both knew it would be wrong, that he was married, that she worked for him, that there were boundaries that should not be crossed, and that those boundaries still existed, even now. Grace nodded, wiping her tears. She said she understood, she agreed, but that made it impossible to go back to working in that house, because now that they had admitted these feelings to each other, how could they pretend nothing had changed? Edward had no answer for that. He knew she was right, but he couldn't accept that it would end like this, with her out of Oliver's life, out of their lives, everything destroyed by fears and insecurities. He asked if she could at least think about it, if she could consider coming back with clear conditions, with well-established boundaries, just for Oliver's sake. He said the boy was already regressing, that he had gone back to being quiet and withdrawn, that he needed her. Grace said she would think about it. She didn't promise anything, but she said she would think. Edward had to be content with that. Before leaving, he said one more thing, that regardless of what she decided about returning to work, he wanted to continue helping with her mother's medical expenses and the other things he had committed to doing, that this had nothing to do with work or his feelings, but rather with the fact that he was in a position to help, and she needed it. Grace wanted to refuse, but Edward was firm. He said it was not negotiable, that he was going to keep doing it, and she couldn't stop him. And then, before she could argue, he said goodbye and left. During the entire drive home, Edward thought about the conversation. They had admitted their feelings to each other, but they had also recognized that they couldn't act on them. So, where did that leave them? When he got home, Eleanor was in the living room waiting for him. She asked where he had been. Edward answered with the truth. He said he had gone to talk to Grace, that he had apologized on behalf of both of them, and that he had tried to convince her to come back. Eleanor turned pale. She asked if he was crazy, if he had completely lost his mind. Edward said no, that he was more lucid than he had been in years. And then, for the first time in a long time, he was completely honest with his wife. He said their marriage had been dead for years, that they both knew it but pretended otherwise, He said Grace was not to blame for anything, that the problems between them existed long before she appeared, and he said that regardless of what Eleanor wanted, he was going to fight to bring Grace back because Oliver needed her. The conversation that followed was long, painful, and necessary. Eleanor cried, Edward did too. They talked about things they had avoided for years, faced truths they had buried under routines and silences, and in the end, they reached a fragile but real agreement. Their marriage was over. Both knew it, but for now they would continue living in the same house, maintaining appearances for Oliver while they decided how to proceed. And Eleanor, with reluctance but with surprising honesty, admitted she had been unfair to Grace, that she had projected onto her fears and insecurities that had nothing to do with the girl. She said that if Grace agreed to return, she would no longer oppose it, provided clear boundaries were established and Oliver was always the priority. It was a start, small, fragile, but a start. Now Edward just needed to convince Grace that it was worth trying again. Grace took 3 days to decide. 3 days of conversations with Martha, of nightly reflections, of weighing risks and benefits. Her mother, with the wisdom of someone who had lived long, said that courage was acting despite fear, and that sometimes the best things came wrapped in complicated situations. On the 3rd day, Grace called Edward. She agreed to return, but with clear conditions. Everything would be professional and transparent, with boundaries established from the start. If there was any discomfort, she could leave without guilt. Edward agreed to everything immediately, the relief evident in his voice. The next day, Grace returned to the house. When the door opened and Oliver appeared running to hug her, she knew she had made the right decision. The boy hugged her for several minutes, saying nothing, but a few tears wet her blouse. She knelt down and said she was back and she wasn't going away again. Helena watched from the stairs. When they locked eyes, there was tension, but also mutual recognition that the situation was too complex for villains and damsels. Eleanor came down and said she hoped to move forward professionally, that Oliver's well-being was the most important thing. Grace agreed, and they exchanged a nod that functioned as a truce. Edward arrived home that afternoon earlier than usual. When he saw Grace in the garden with Oliver, the two planting new seedlings to replace the ones that had died during her absence, he felt something tighten in his chest. It was a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something deeper he didn't yet have the courage to fully name. He approached and greeted Grace politely, maintaining appropriate physical distance, but she saw in his eyes everything that couldn't be said out loud, and he saw the same in hers. That silent recognition that there was something between them, but that they had both chosen not to act on it, at least not while circumstances were as they were. The following weeks established a new routine, more controlled and professional. But gradually, with Oliver serving as a bridge, things relaxed. Edward and Eleanor started couples therapy, not to save the marriage, but to coexist healthily. In the sessions, truths emerged. Eleanor admitted feeling abandoned long before Grace appeared. Edward admitted having hidden in work to avoid the emotional void of the marriage. The therapist suggested an amicable separation that allowed for honesty while keeping Oliver as the priority. The idea frightened both of them at first, but it made sense. It took months, but they decided to separate. Edward would keep the house and Eleanor would buy a nearby apartment. Oliver would spend time with both, prioritizing stability. The news was difficult for Oliver. He cried, asked if it was his fault. Edward and Eleanor, united in purpose, explained that it was no one's fault, that sometimes paths diverged, but the love for him would never change. Grace was there as a stable presence, helping Oliver process his feelings, to understand that families could have different shapes. Gradually, the boy accepted the new reality. 6 months after the separation, with Eleanor already living in her own apartment and Oliver's routine established, Edward finally allowed himself to look at the future in a different way. He was no longer a married man living a lie. He was a divorced man, a dedicated father, and someone who had the chance to start over honestly. One night, after Oliver was already asleep, Edward asked Grace to stay a little longer. He said he wanted to talk about something important. Grace stayed, although with a certain visible apprehension in her eyes. They sat in the living room, the same one where months ago Eleanor had accused Grace of terrible things. But now the atmosphere was different, lighter. truer. Edward began by saying he had spent a long time thinking about everything that had happened, about the choices he had made, and about what he really wanted from life. He said he admired Grace not just for what she had done for Oliver, but for who she was as a person. He said that during that entire difficult separation process, she had been a constant presence of strength and kindness, and that now, for the first time in a long time, he was free to be honest about his feelings without betraying anyone. Grace felt her heart race. She knew what was coming next, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Edward continued. He said he understood if she didn't want to risk it, if she preferred to keep things as they were, professional and safe. But if she were willing, he would like the chance to get to know her better, not as employer and employee, but as two people who cared for each other. Grace was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was cautious but honest. She said she also had feelings for him, that she had tried to deny them for a long time because it felt wrong, impossible. But now, with everything that had changed, perhaps it was possible to explore that with care. She set conditions. They needed to go slowly, very slowly. She still worked for him, and that created a power imbalance they couldn't ignore. They needed to keep everything separate, the professional from the personal. And Oliver needed to always be the priority, his feelings and well-being above any romance between adults. Edward agreed to everything, and then, with a caution that bordered on reverence, he held her hand. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. Years of distance, months of complications, weeks of uncertainties, all culminating in that touch. The following months were a time of discovery. Edward and Grace met outside the house, talking for hours. Edward learned about Grace's dreams of opening an educational space, about her love for literature. Grace learned about his insecurities, about how success had never filled the emotional void. Oliver noticed the changes and saw his father happier, more present. When Edward asked how he would feel if Grace became more than just a caregiver, the boy smiled and said he already thought she was part of the family. The relationship flourished gradually but solidly. There were doubts, difficult conversations, and constant adjustments, but there was a foundation of mutual respect and genuine admiration. Eleanor found her own peace. The separation freed her to be who she really was. She went back to school and started her own projects. When she saw Edward and Grace together, she felt only a faint echo of what had once been hurt. 2 years after that rainy afternoon when Grace had been dismissed, she and Edward were sitting in the same garden where she had planted sunflowers with Oliver for the first time. The flowers had grown tall and strong, just like Oliver, who was now 8 years old and a confident, curious, and happy child. Edward held Grace's hand and said he had something to ask. Grace laughed because she already knew what was coming. She had seen it in his eyes for weeks. But she let him speak anyway, because some moments deserved their own words. Edward said he had never imagined his life could transform so much, that he had started in a place of emptiness and loneliness, had gone through pain and deconstruction, but had arrived at something real, something true. He said Grace had been the spark that started it all, not because she had come with the intention of changing anything, but simply by being who she was. And now he wanted to make official what everyone already knew. He wanted her to not just be the person who cared for his son, or the person with whom he shared moments. He wanted her to be his partner in everything. Grace felt the tears coming, but they were tears of joy. She said yes before he even finished the question. And there, in that garden where so much had begun, they sealed not just a romantic commitment, but a conscious choice to build a life together with honesty, respect, and true love. Oliver, who had watched everything from his bedroom window, came running down and threw himself into both their arms. And for the first time in a long time, that huge house in the Gold Coast felt like a real home. Not perfect, because perfection doesn't exist, but real, alive, and full of possibilities, full of... Edward and Grace's story had not been easy. It had involved pain, mistakes, snap judgments, and moments of nearly giving up. But it had also proven that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. That a caregiver hired to help with a child can become the missing piece in a whole family. That it is possible to start over, even when everything seems lost. And that true love, the kind built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and admiration, is worth every challenge faced. Years later, when they told this story to friends, always with Oliver nearby adding his own memories, Edward and Grace agreed on one thing. They weren't sure if they believed in destiny, but they believed that some people enter our lives exactly at the moment we need them most, and that having the courage to recognize that, to act on it, and to fight for it despite all obstacles, was what transformed coincidences into something greater. That house in the Gold Coast, which had been the stage for so much silence and distance, now echoed with laughter, conversation, music, and life. Oliver grew up surrounded by adults who had learned, through much effort and honesty, to put what really mattered first. And Grace and Edward, two so different worlds that met in unlikely circumstances, built together something that neither of them could have imagined alone. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how a story begins. It matters how people choose to write it chapter by chapter, decision by decision, true moment by true moment. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Edward, Grace, and Oliver has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of new beginnings, overcoming obstacles, and true love, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Every